The year is 1940, and the British Empire is kneeling in the dirt. The beaches of Dunkirk have just swallowed the pride of the British Army. Hundreds of thousands of men escaped across the Channel, but they left their teeth behind. The sand dunes of France are littered with the finest engineering of the interwar years, thousands of trucks, artillery pieces, and, most critically, small arms. Britain stands alone against a Nazi war machine that seems invincible, a juggernaut of polished steel and precision engineering. Across the water, the Wehrmacht is gathering, singing songs of conquest. Their soldiers armed with the terrifying MP-40 submachine gun, a weapon that spits death at 500 rounds per minute. In London, the cupboard is bare. The Home Guard is drilling with broomsticks. The regular army is counting cartridges. If the Germans land tomorrow, they will be met with little more than courage and rusted sporting rifles. It is in this hour of absolute, suffocating desperation that a weapon is born. It is not a weapon of beauty. It is not a weapon of prestige. It is a weapon of necessity, a ugly, rude, mechanical insult to the art of gunsmithing. It is the Sten Dot. To understand the Sten Gun, you must first understand the terror of that summer. The British military establishment was conservative, steeped in the traditions of the Lee-Enfield rifle, a weapon of wood and craftsmanship. Designed for marksmanship at 300 yards, they looked down on submachine guns as gangster weapons, tools for Chicago criminals, not gentlemen soldiers. But the Blitzkrieg changed the rules of the game. War was no longer about static lines and long-range volleys. It was about speed, shock, and volume of fire. The British needed submachine guns, and they needed them yesterday. They looked to America, purchasing the Thompson M1928. The Thompson was a work of art, machined from solid steel billets, polished and fitted with walnut stocks. It was also heavy, complicated, and cost nearly $200 a unit, a fortune Britain could not afford. With U-boats strangling the Atlantic supply lines, Britain needed a domestic solution. They needed a gun that could be built in a garage, a bicycle factory, or a laundry shop. They needed a gun that cost nothing and killed everything. Enter Major Reginald V. Shepherd and Mr. Harold J. Turpin of the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. They took the first letters of their last names, St, and added the E on for Enfield. The result was the Sten. When the first prototypes emerged, soldiers stared at them in disbelief. It looked like a piece of plumbing. It was a simple metal tube with a barrel welded to the front and a crude metal skeleton for a stock. There was no wood, no polish, no elegance. It was held together by rough welds and hope. It cost roughly £2.50 to make, about $10 at the time. You could build 15 Stens for the price of a single Thompson. It took 5 man-hours to manufacture. It was the Woolworth gun, the plumber's nightmare, the stench gun, but it fired the 9mm parabellum round, the exact same ammunition used by the Germans. This was a stroke of logistical genius, or perhaps theft. It meant that a British commando or a French partisan could kill a German soldier and use his ammunition to keep fighting. The mechanics of the Sten were as crude as its appearance. It operated on a simple blowback principle. A heavy metal bolt sat inside the tube, held back by a spring. When you pulled the trigger, the bolt flew forward, stripped a round from the side-mounted magazine, slammed it into the chamber, and fired it. The explosion blew the bolt back, ejecting the casing, and the process repeated. There was no locking mechanism, no complex gas system. It was a machine designed to do one thing: turn a piece of stamped metal into a fire hose of lead. But this simplicity came with a terrifying price. The Sten was notorious for its safety issues, or rather, the lack thereof. If a soldier dropped a loaded Sten with the bolt forward, the jolt could knock the bolt back just enough to pick up a round, but not enough to catch the sear. The spring would then drive it forward, firing the weapon. The recoil would cock it again, and the gun would begin the Sten dance, spinning on the floor, spraying bullets in a 360-degree circle until the magazine was empty. Tales abounded of toes lost and shins shattered in barracks by Stens that decided to fight their own war. Despite its temperamental nature, the Sten was thrust into the hands of soldiers who had nothing else. Its baptism by fire came in the raid on Dieppe in August 1942. Operation Jubilee was a disaster, a meat grinder on the pebble beaches of France. Canadian troops stormed ashore, many armed with the new Sten Mk2. It was here that the weapons flaws were brutally exposed. The soldiers had been issued the guns straight from the crates, still covered in thick storage grease. In the chaos of the landing, the sand of the beach mixed with the grease to form a grinding paste that jammed the open bolts. Men frantically kicked at the bolts of their weapons as German machine gun fire tore them apart. It was a harsh lesson in maintenance. The Sten thrived on neglect. It didn't need oil. It needed to be dry. Oil just attracted dirt. But for the men dying on the shale at Dieppe, that lesson came too late. The reputation of the Sten took a hit that it would would never fully recover from in the eyes of the regular infantry. However, while the regular army grumbled, a shadow army was falling in love with the ugly little tube. The Special Operations Executive saw the Sten not as a military rifle, but as the perfect tool for assassination and sabotage. It was light, stripping down into 3 small pieces that could be hidden in a loaf of bread, a false-bottomed suitcase, or the frame of a bicycle. It was the perfect weapon to drop from the belly of a Halifax bomber into the moonlit fields of occupied Europe. To the French Maquis, the Norwegian Resistance, and the Polish Home Army, the Sten was a gift from the gods. It didn't matter that it wasn't accurate past 50 yards. Resistance work was done at 5 yards, in the dark, in alleyways and German dining halls. The distinctive rattle of the Sten became the soundtrack of the Resistance. The most dramatic and consequential use of the Sten occurred on a sharp curve in a road in Prague. On May 27, 1942, Operation Anthropoid was the mission to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, the butcher of Prague and the architect of the final solution. 2 Czechoslovak paratroopers, Josef Gabke and Jan Kubis, had parachuted in from Britain. They waited at a tram stop for Heydrich's open-topped Mercedes. As the car slowed around the hairpin turn, Gabke stepped into the road, threw off his raincoat, and raised his Sten gun. He aimed directly at the chest of the second most powerful man in the SS. He pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. The Sten had jammed. It was the nightmare scenario. The cheap spring, the stamped metal, or perhaps the magazine lips had failed at the pivot of history. Heydrich stood up in the car to draw his pistol. It was only the quick thinking of Kubis, who threw a modified anti-tank grenade, that saved the mission. Heydrich died of his wounds days later, but the jammed Sten haunted Gabke until his own death in a church crypt weeks later. It was a failure that illustrated the terrifying gamble of using mass-produced bottom-dollar weaponry for precision work. Yet, for every jam, there were thousands of successes. In the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, the Sten was the gold standard. The Polish Resistance even began manufacturing their own versions in underground workshops. They created the Błyskawica, or lightning gun, a hybrid of the Sten's internals and the MP40's layout. These guns were built under the noses of the Nazi occupiers, tested in basements while trams rumbled overhead to mask the noise. The Sten's design was so simple that you didn't need a gun factory to make it. You just needed a lathe and a drill press. It democratized automatic fire. It allowed a ragtag force of students and shopkeepers to hold off the Wehrmacht for 63 days. In the ruins of Warsaw, the Sten was not a plumber's nightmare. It was the voice of a nation refusing to die. By 1944, the tide of the war had turned, and the Sten evolved. The British Army, preparing for the invasion of Europe, needed something better than the crude Mk2. They introduced the Mkv. This was the gentrified Sten. It featured a wooden pistol grip, a wooden stock, and the front sight of a Lee Enfield rifle. It even had a bayonet lug, a terrifyingly optimistic addition for a submachine gun. This was the weapon of the British paratroopers, the Red Devils, when they dropped into the Netherlands for Operation Market Garden. The Sten Mkv was strapped to their chests. The Battle of Arnhem became the defining epic of the Sten in regular combat. In the tight brick streets of Oosterbeek and Arnhem, the long-range rifles of the infantry were useless. The fighting was room to room, staircased. Here, the Sten's high rate of fire and compact size shone. Paratroopers, surrounded and outgunned by SS Panzer divisions, used their Stens to shred German infantry assaults. There are accounts of British paras holding the stairwells of the Hartenstein Hotel, firing burst after burst until the barrels of their Stens glowed red hot. They would wrap wet rags around the barrel cooling jackets to keep firing. The Sten Dance was no longer a liability but a tactic. Men would spray suppressed fire blindly around corners. In the desperate perimeter at Oosterbeek, where ammunition was low, the ability to scavenge 9mm rounds from dead Germans became a lifesaver. The Mkv proved that the Sten had grown up. It was still ugly, but it was a soldier's weapon now. But the Sten had a darker, quieter sibling, the Mk2S and Mk6. These were suppressed versions, featuring an integral silencer. They were used by the Commandos and the SAS. The silencer was effective, reducing the report of the gun to a mere mechanical clack of the bolt. However, the silencer slowed the bullet down to subsonic speeds, drastically reducing its penetrating power. Soldiers were taught to fire in short bursts, and to aim for the head, as the heavy winter coats of German sentries could sometimes stop a subsonic supersonic round at range. These silent killers were used in raids across Norway and France, taking out guards and sentries before the main assault began. They were the tools of the Phantom War, used by men with blackened faces who moved in the night as the Allies pushed into Germany. The sheer number of Stens in circulation was staggering. Over 4 million had been produced. They were everywhere. They were in the hands of tank crews, truck drivers, artillerymen, and cooks. The philosophy was that in modern war, everyone needed firepower. A truck driver ambushed by a German patrol couldn't defend himself with a bolt-action rifle. He needed to spray and pray. The Sten gave every man the firepower of a squad. It changed the tactical doctrine of the British Army. Fire and maneuver became fluid. The volume of fire a British platoon could put out was exponentially higher than in 1939. The Germans, who had started the war with the superior submachine guns, found themselves drowned in a sea of cheap British steel. There is a strange irony in the Sten's magazine. It was a direct copy of the magazine used in the German MP-28 and MP-40. It was a duppy-column single-feed design. This was the single greatest flaw of the weapon. It was difficult to load. You needed a special tool or thumbs of steel to get the last few rounds in. It was prone to jamming if dirt got into the single feed lips. By copying the German design to use their ammo, the British also copied the Germans' biggest mistake. If the British had designed a double-feed magazine like the Thompson or the later Sterling, the Sten might have been remembered as one of the best guns of the war. Instead, the magazine remained its Achilles heel, the source of 90% of its stoppages. Soldiers learned to tap the magazine against their helmet before loading it, to settle the rounds. It was a ritual, a superstitious prayer to the god of mechanics before the shooting started. The war ended, but the Sten did not. It flooded the black markets of the world. It appeared in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, used by both sides. It was used in the Malayan Emergency, where British troops slogged through the jungle hunting communist insurgents. It was used in Korea. It ended up in the hands of revolutionaries, criminals, and freedom fighters from Africa to Asia. It was so easy to make that it became the blueprint for improvised weapons worldwide. The WWII submachine gun and other homemade designs owe their lineage to the plumbing pipe genius of Shepard and Turpin. The Sten proved that you didn't need a factory to build an army. You just needed a design that stripped a weapon down to its absolute, violent essentials. Looking back, the Sten gun is a study in contrasts. It was hated by the men who were issued it, yet loved by the men who needed it. It was dangerously unsafe, yet brutally effective. It was cheap, nasty, and ugly, yet it saved the British Empire. It is easy to look at a museum piece, today a rusted, grey tube with a crude weld seam and laugh at it. It looks like a toy, a piece of scrap metal. But if you listen closely to the history, you can hear the rattle of that loose bolt in the silence of a French field waiting for a parachute drop. You can hear the desperate metallic clatter in the streets of Arnhem. You can hear the roar of a factory in 1940, working through the night while bombs fell on London, stamping out these steel saviors one by one. The Sten was not a weapon of choice. It was a weapon of survival. It was the physical embodiment of Britain's keep calm and carry on spirit, but with a harder, more violent edge. It was the realization that when your back is against the wall, you don't need a Stradivarius. You need a hammer. And for 5 years, the Sten was the hammer that broke the Third Reich. It taught the world that quantity has a quality all its own, and that sometimes the ugliest solution is the only one that works. It remains, to this day, the most democratic weapon ever made, a gun for the masses. Built by the masses, to liberate the masses. In the end, the Sten gun faded away, replaced by the superior Sterling submachine gun in the 1950s. The Sterling was better made, reliable, and had a good magazine. But the Sterling was a weapon of peace and the Cold War. The Sten was the weapon of the fire. It belongs to the muddy ditches, the ruined cities, and the dark forests of the 1940s. It belongs to the brave men and women who held it in shaking hands, praying that the bolt would fly forward, that the primer would ignite, and that the cheap steel tube would spit fire one more time. It was the plumber's nightmare that became the Nazis' nightmare, and for that, it deserves its place in the pantheon of legends.